Welcome to the July 2025 session of Teaching Tuesday at Hub City Vineyard. Tonight we've got an apologetics presentation on why we believe God exists, but you could also think of it as why it's logical and rational. You might even say that God existing is the only logical conclusion given the evidence. We'll start by discussing when and why this question might come up during evangelism before jumping into that evidence. Now, I'm not just doing this to give you more tools in your apologetics toolbox. I've selected arguments from a variety of disciplines because, if we're honest, all of us have had doubts about God in at least one area. This is as much about strengthening our faith as it is sharing it. Tonight's resource is a book called Darwin's Black Box by Michael J. Behe. I used about a dozen books to collect all of tonight's information, but Darwin's Black Box is the biggest departure from any of the books I've recommended previously. We're going to look at it in more detail later, but the general idea is that as we learn more about what happens inside cells, we find mechanisms and processes that are called irreducibly complex, meaning they could not have evolved naturally because they needed all of the component parts or steps to function. It put the nail in the coffin for evolution for me, and I think you'll all find it just as interesting. The argument presented in Darwin's Black Box is one of many I'll be presenting tonight as evidence that God exists. But before we get into those arguments, it's time for a brief history lesson. In Acts 17, 16 through 33, Paul is telling people in Athens about Jesus, and it's causing quite a ruckus. First, he gets taken to the city council, then he gets taken to the Areopagus or Mars Hill, depending on your translation. He's face to face with civic leaders and the greatest philosophers in the nation. He begins his speech by mentioning an altar to the unknown God, a God that the Athenians thought existed but were otherwise ignorant to its identity. Paul tells them that this unknown God is actually the God, the Father, and proceeds to deliver an evangelistic and apologetic message on Jesus. Paul structured his presentation as such because 99.999999999% of people in the history of humanity up to the 1800s shared a worldview with two essential aspects. First, it's ridiculous they even have to mention this, people believed in objective reality and truth. The world is real, we are real, and there are true facts about the world that we can ascertain. Second, it was obvious to everyone from observing the world around them that there was just some sort of God or gods. The supernatural was a fact of life. There were just disagreements over the details. Paul didn't need to argue for these two aspects because everybody already accepted them. Well, I mentioned the 1800s, and that's when the trouble started. Humanity started making rapid scientific and philosophical progress in what we now call the Enlightenment. Now, that part isn't necessarily bad by itself. We discovered answers to many of the greatest mysteries from the past. But the problem happened when we decided that if we could demystify those aspects of our existence, we could do it for all of them. Belief in God became an intellectual liability, a sign of low intelligence and lack of trust in science and human reason. We still see this attitude in universities, media, and popular culture, with religious people often characterized as unintelligent, ill-informed, and gullible. Then the second blow came in the 1960s. One strength of the Enlightenment mindset was that people believed in an objective reality, the one that humanity was studying and mastering. In what some people believed to be a movement to deliberately sabotage Western civilization, a new philosophy called postmodernism erupted from the universities. There's a spectrum of postmodern views, but it can be summed up as a rejection of objective truth and reality. To them, everything is subjective, and nothing can be said to be objectively true. And so the modern Christian evangelist or apologist can't jump right in like Paul did, because many people he encounters will reject objective truth or the supernatural or both. I need to spend a lot more time studying postmodernism before I feel qualified to talk about it, so tonight we're making the case for the supernatural, in particular, that God exists. Now, there are a ton of arguments for God's existence, and apologists have come up with just as many different ways to categorize them. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm using three categories. We'll call them philosophical, scientific, and Christian-specific, and we'll look at each one and why I've chosen to divide them that way as we go through the arguments. We'll start with the philosophical category, and these arguments are those that are made through internal observation, things like logic, reason, and contemplation. Because they can't be tested scientifically, they are often very polarizing, with some people finding them the most convincing and others rejecting them totally. We'll start with the moral argument, which follows a pattern we'll see a few more times tonight. It starts with an assertion or condition about reality, makes an observation about reality, then uses that observation to support the assertion. For the moral argument, the assertion is that if objective morality exists, then a source of that objective morality must exist, something you could call an objective moral lawgiver. Now, the observation made is that objective morality does exist. This may seem obvious to the Christian, but atheists often push back against this claim. So you can present them with some questions like, is it ever okay to kill an innocent person for fun? Or is it ever okay to beat up babies for fun? Obviously not. Opponents of objective morality often argue that all morality is subjective. So you could also look at an example from World War II. When the Nazis were put on trial at the Nuremberg trials, they acknowledged that their actions were wrong, but claimed that they were done to defeat a greater evil. Many defended their actions by saying they were just following orders. The tribunal did not agree. They argued that individuals were obligated to disobey evil orders because of their responsibility to a higher authority. There is an inherent value to human life that all humans seem to understand, even if they choose to commit evil acts. And so, if this objective morality exists, then an objective moral lawgiver, the one we would call God, exists. The next philosophical argument is called the argument from reason. It says that if our sense of consciousness and ability to think were products of evolution and operated solely on laws of physics, that makes us just organic machines, and our thoughts are nothing more than illusions. But all humans have a shared experience of thinking and inferring information, and although we're not perfectly rational beings, our brains are capable of drawing accurate inferences and displaying creativity. We have idle thoughts and emotions that are unnecessary for survival and reproduction, so why would we have evolved this way? That seems like a waste of resources. This collection of attributes and our personal experiences of consciousness that we assume everyone else has, they point to our minds as something beyond the physical, something supernatural in nature and origin. To the Christian, our minds are exactly what one would expect if people were created in the image of a rational creator. Next up is the ontological argument. This is easily the most polarizing philosophical argument for God's existence. Personally, I don't think it's a good argument, and I can't imagine it convincing anyone, let alone an atheist. On the other hand, several of the most skilled contemporary apologists think that it's one of the most convincing. God gave us all different talents, passions, and styles of learning, so if I can help someone somewhere, then I'm happy to present it regardless of my personal opinion. Either way, it goes like this. Think of God as a maximally great being, something that is the best in every possible aspect. That lines up with the Christian conception of God. Now, if you had one version of God that did not exist and one version that did, the version that did exist would be better than the one that did not. Therefore, since it is possible that God exists, it is necessary that God exists in order to be maximally great. This next argument blew my mind the first time I heard it. In the argument against infinite regression, we both argue against an infinitely old universe or an infinite series of causes, and we set the stage for some of the science-based arguments. Let's look at time first. If, as many atheists claim, the universe is infinitely old, and our current version of the universe is just one of an infinitely old series of universes, that puts us on that circle in the middle of the timeline. However, that presents a logical problem. Many atheists will call the present moment zero, and then start counting to infinity in either direction, arguing that that's logically valid. But that's not an accurate representation. If there were actually an infinite amount of time before the present, we could never have gotten to the present day. Similarly, consider the series of events leading up to this moment. I am teaching this class because 40 years ago my parents watched a romantic movie. My parents exist because 30 years before that their parents, I guess, read a romantic telegraph? I don't know, but the point is, we can trace back to Adam and Eve, the creation of the universe, and so on. But at some point we run into a problem. If we don't have a first cause, it's the same argument we used against infinite time. We never would have gotten to the present. So to summarize all of this, we can say that logically, there must be an uncaused first cause, and that cause is what we would call God. But we can also go further by building on that foundation. The Kalam cosmological argument straddles the border of philosophy and science, so it's a good transition between the two. It's made up of three statements just like some of the other arguments. First is the assertion that whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Second is the assertion that the universe began to exist. Therefore, we conclude that the universe has a cause of existence. The whole argument hinges on the assertion that the universe began to exist. So can we justify that? Yes, both scientifically and philosophically. Our previous argument was that we can't have an infinitely old universe or an infinite chain of causes. That's the philosophical answer. The scientific answer comes in the form of the Big Bang, a theory that was developed by a Christian astronomer who was mocked by academics for suggesting that the universe wasn't eternal. But it's now the leading theory for the origin of the universe, and it's fully compatible with Christian theology. We observe that the universe is running out of energy and expanding. Our telescopes show leftover radiation from the Big Bang, which could only have come from a hot, dense origin. Einstein's theory of general relativity shows that matter, space, and time are interdependent and all had a simultaneous beginning. And what's truly fascinating about the Kalam cosmological argument is that it doesn't just stop by saying that there is a cause of existence. As I just mentioned, when we say universe, we're talking about matter, space, and time, all coming into existence at once. So whatever made the universe is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Because the universe was created from nothing, we can conclude that whatever this cause is must have chosen to create, meaning it is personal. And finally, given the complexity and scale of the universe, this cause must also be intelligent and powerful. The Kalam cosmological argument is considered the gold standard of Christian apologetic arguments, because it gives us a picture of a universal creator that sounds just like the Christian God. As I mentioned, the Kalam cosmological argument is our bridge between philosophical and scientific arguments for God's existence. And now we're going to focus on the purely scientific arguments. These use observations and experiments to demonstrate that God is the best and the only explanation for many aspects of our existence and the universe in which we exist. Now, this slide should look pretty familiar. It's called the teleological or fine-tuning argument, and this is one we looked at when we did our introduction to apologetics. This argument says that the universe appears precisely designed for life. And the examples that we looked at previously were the strength of gravity, the expansion of space, and some of the conditions specific to Earth. Now, these are just 3 examples, but we find more and more of these factors every year. And we find that, for instance, if gravity was a minute percent different in either direction, it would make stars, planets, and life impossible. If the expansion of space was minutely faster, it would prevent galaxies from forming. If it was minutely slower, space would have collapsed in on itself. Earth, for example, if the chemical composition of the atmosphere, the amount of water, the rotational period, Jupiter's exact size and orbit were different by minuscule amounts, life would be impossible on Earth. And like I said, we keep finding more and more of these factors. And so scientists currently estimate that the chance of life naturally occurring on one planet in the entire universe is 1 in 10 to the 138th. Now that is a massive number. It's far too big for us to be able to conceptualize. It means nothing to us because it's such a big number. Now we can sort of put it in context by saying that there are 10 to the 70th atoms in the universe. And so you can imagine that you set out and you had to search for one specific atom in the entire universe. And your chance of finding that one specific atom by checking a random atom is 1 in 10 to the 70th. But because it is 1 in 10 to the 138th, if you imagine that there's an entire universe, the size of our universe, inside that one particular atom you were looking for, and then you were looking for a specific atom inside that universe that was already contained in a specific atom, then the chance of finding that specific universe would be picking the one atom and then picking another atom in that other universe. It is such an incomprehensibly big number that keeps getting bigger every year. It is just logically nearly impossible that this happened by chance and that it wasn't designed by a creator. So as we move into the next argument, I'm not going to pretend that I understand everything happening in this diagram. There's a reason that I studied computer science and not biology or chemistry. This stuff just blows my mind. It's tough for me to understand. But what it demonstrates is the central point of the book I recommended earlier called Darwin's Black Box. And that point is a concept called irreducible complexity. Essentially, there are a massive number of structures and processes happening in our bodies which are made up of pieces or steps that all had to be in place for that structure or process to function. Additionally, many, if not most of these pieces and steps have no purpose other than being a part of the final structure or process. Supporters of evolution argue that everything in our bodies evolved naturally over many small steps, but the discovery of these irreducibly complex structures and processes makes that logically improbable, if not impossible. Looking at the example on the screen, which again I will not pretend I fully understand, we can see this concept illustrated in the blood clotting cascade, which is how your body reacts when you get cut to stop the bleeding. This process has to be very precise. If clotting happened too easily, your blood would clot when it shouldn't, and you would die. If clotting didn't trigger properly, you'd bleed out and die. The series of steps you see on the screen make sure that clotting happens at exactly the right time and under the proper conditions, and only to the right extent. However, all of those steps need to happen in that exact order for the process to work. It couldn't have evolved over time unless there was an intelligence guiding that evolution. And we see a similar or greater levels of irreducible complexity in a multitude of other places in our bodies. It's as if God's signature is all over the tiny machines that make our bodies run. So go read Darwin's Black Box and hear it explained by an expert. It's about 100 times more convincing. And speaking of experts, you should also take a look at the book called Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer. But I'll do my best to explain why DNA and biological information storage also point to God's existence. Most people listening to this have heard of DNA and understand the basic concept. The DNA stores the genetic information that determines the properties of our bodies, such as height, hair color, eye color, and even immunity or susceptibility to certain diseases. This information is stored in sequences of 4 different nucleotides, which we represent as 4 letters. DNA gets unzipped, specific sequences are read by something called RNA, then it gets zipped back up, and the copied information is used to create proteins, which are the building blocks of various things in our bodies. So what does this have to do with God? Well, first, the entire thing is a shining example of irreducible complexity. None of those parts, the DNA, the RNA, the unzipper, the zipper, the protein factories, have an independent function. They all need each other to function. So thinking that they could have evolved independently makes no sense. Second, let's grant that they evolved independently, just for the sake of argument. If so, where did the DNA for the first organism come from? And that points to the biggest problem of all. The closest analogy we have to DNA is computer code. Who designed the code and determined what the individual nucleotides and sequences of nucleotides would mean? The entire system and all the rules needed to be implemented all at once. If we saw this system anywhere besides the human body, we'd insist that a computer programmer had created it. So why do we make an exception for the DNA system in our bodies when it's clear that it also had a programmer? God. And then we'll wrap up our scientific arguments with another bridge argument, this time between the scientific arguments and the Christian-specific arguments. In particular, we see the confirmation of ancient scientific assertions made in the Bible, which have only recently been confirmed by modern science. One of these examples comes from the book of Job. And basically, near the end of the book, Job questions God. And as part of God's response to Job, he says, "Can you direct the movement of the stars, binding the cluster of the Pleiades, or loosening the cords of Orion? Can you direct the constellations through the seasons, or guide the bear with her cubs across the heavens?" This happens in Job 38, 31 to 32. Now, this just sounded like, big, grand, cosmological language that didn't really mean anything until modern science started looking at these star clusters and constellations with modern telescopes. Some of these things we've only been able to confirm within the last couple decades. And these are amazing. These blew my mind the first time I heard them. For instance, when God says, "binding the cluster of the Pleiades," ancient people couldn't have known that the Pleiades is a star cluster. They are bound gravitationally to each other. They also couldn't have known that Orion was not a cluster. So when God says loosening the cords of Orion, the ancient people couldn't have known that Orion isn't a star cluster or isn't linked together, and they're actually starting to move apart. And finally, when God says directing the constellations through the seasons or guiding the bear with her cubs across the heavens, well, we didn't know until incredibly recently that the bear, or Arcturus, wasn't a single star, but it's actually 53. Well, that's the bear and her cubs. Scholars believe that Job is the oldest book in the Bible. It was passed down by oral tradition before it was recorded. This information would have been impossible for these people to know unless it was given to them by the very creator of the universe. So other than that final bridge argument we looked at with the confirmation of ancient scientific assertions, the arguments for God's existence to this point have been fairly general. They could apply to any single creator God, not necessarily the God of the Bible. Now, however, we're going to look at arguments for God's existence that are specific to the God of the Bible, and they allow us to make the case that he exists as the one true God. But it's also fair to say that these arguments might be a little bit tricky. They may not necessarily be convincing to non-Christians, but they can act as a confirmation of faith to Christians. A good example of this is the first one, which is the personal witness of the Holy Spirit. Many apologists will say that it is the best evidence to an individual that God exists. Every single Christian has had the experience of an interaction with the Holy Spirit. It might be something small, like a feeling or an emotion, or it could be something dramatic, like God pointing you or pushing you in a certain direction for your life that was totally unexpected. It is impossible to explain to people who haven't experienced it, but every Christian has had this experience. They have had a personal encounter and interaction with God, and it is something that is unmistakable. It is something totally distinct from any other encounter that you've ever had in your life. And this goes hand in hand with the second argument, which is the radical transformation by the Holy Spirit. These are extreme life and personality changes that are unlikely or impossible to be made by a person on their own, like breaking an addiction or with no withdrawal. Now, skeptics will often dismiss this as coincidence or a person exercising their will, but the sheer volume and the extent that we see these, even here in our own church, is overwhelming. Now, let me share a personal story for this one, because this is what convinced me that God was real. You see, way back before I was a Christian, back when I was a teenager, I started having some very serious health problems. It involved muscle pain, joint pain, muscle spasms. Basically, over time, over the period of a couple of years, my entire body was in extreme pain. My parents got very concerned about this early on when it started, and as it got more and more serious, they went through a lot of trouble and a lot of time to take me to a ton of different doctors. I went to doctors at different hospitals in different cities, and nobody could understand what was going on with me. They did all sorts of tests. They did blood work. They took samples of everything you can imagine, and some of it was pretty painful. And I probably went to 40 or 50 different doctors over the course of a couple of years. Nobody had any idea what was going on with me. And finally, when I was about 18 or 19, my primary care doctor, he felt bad for me. I was in constant pain all the time. And he said, listen, they don't know what's going on with you. I'm just going to give you something to help you with the pain and to help you manage the symptoms. Now, I hold no ill will against him for this. He was simply trying to treat me to the best of his ability. But as many of us know, painkillers and muscle relaxers tend to not work as well over time. And so you have to keep bumping up the dose. And so that's what got me hooked on painkillers and muscle relaxers. And over the course of many years, it went from one small pill to a handful of pills every day. And I think it's fair to say that I was pretty irresponsible in it. I was using higher doses than I should have just because I felt so bad all the time. I started getting queasy to my stomach. I started feeling depressed. It really changes your personality a lot. I would wash these things down with alcohol. And then I even tried other drugs, much more severe drugs, to give me the energy back that I was losing from these. And this went on for a very long time. And so the day that I got saved, I remember laying in bed that night and saying to myself, God, there's obviously a lot of things in my life that need changed. Please help me make that change. When I woke up the next day, it was almost like I was watching myself work on autopilot. I remember waking up and getting a trash bag and walking around my apartment and throwing out all of those pills and all the alcohol and all the other stuff. And I chucked it in the trash. And what's remarkable and impossible, unless it was God working, is that after almost 2 decades of taking all these various substances, I didn't have a single moment of withdrawal. God saved me from that. And that is the type of radical transformation that we see all the time here in HCV and millions of Christians see around the world. In 1 Corinthians 15:14-15 in the NIV translation, Paul says, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God. For we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead." According to Paul, Jesus' death and resurrection are the critical element of Christianity. They prove all of Jesus' claims correct. If the resurrection happened, Christianity is true. If the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity is false. Because of Christ's claims, if Christianity is true, then God exists and everything that's written in the Bible about God is true. Consider this a preview of an upcoming session because this topic deserves its own session and there's so much material here that we could spend a couple hours on it. But let me give you two important pieces of evidence. The first is this. When we look in the Bible, the Jewish authorities accuse the apostles of stealing Jesus' body. They don't deny that the tomb is empty. They don't deny that the body is missing. Had the Romans or the Jews taken Jesus' body, they could have produced it and debunked the entire argument. But they knew that the body was missing. Church tradition holds that all of the apostles except for John were martyred for maintaining the truth of Jesus' resurrection. History puts us fairly certain at 4 or 5 of them were, and we don't know about the rest. But the point is that the one group of people who would know for sure whether Jesus had died and come back to life were all willing to die for their belief that Jesus did come back to life. If they had stolen the body or were any way involved in some sort of conspiracy, they wouldn't have allowed themselves to be tortured and killed to maintain that story. And that's just barely scratching the surface of the evidence we have for Jesus' resurrection. And like I said, we'll tackle this in a future section. And then we come to the argument from fulfilled prophecy. You probably heard Chris talk about this several times at Easter. I know this is a big focal point of when I tell the Easter story to the kids. Now we have to acknowledge that almost every religion offers prophecies, and occasionally they get one correct. But on the low end, the God of the Bible has fulfilled at least 300 prophecies, with many scholars putting the number significantly higher. Even more importantly, he has never been wrong. It would be one thing if the Bible made millions of predictions and got 300 correct, but got thousands of them wrong. But that's not the case. No prophecy or information contained in the Bible has ever been found to be incorrect. And so who else will be able to tell the future accurately other than the God who is outside of time and is able to see that future exactly? And then our final Christian-specific argument is the unique and exceptional history of Christianity. This is another topic that deserves its entire discussion, so let me just give you the 30-second version. The basic premise is that what started as a small, heavily persecuted sect of Judaism not only survived, but became the official religion of the Roman Empire and the dominant religion of the world. But this wasn't done through military conquest like Islam, but through peace and charity. People converted to Christianity because they saw that radical personal transformation of the Holy Spirit. The people in Rome were blown away by the charity shown by Christians. You see, there was a common practice in Rome called exposure, where when people had a baby and they didn't want it or they thought something was wrong with it, they would just leave it outside at night and the wild dogs would, get the baby. Now, Christians were vehemently opposed to this process, so they would go around at night and pick up these exposure babies. Christians started the first orphanages to care for these babies. They started free hospitals. They did free meals for people. They took care of orphans and widows. They showed people that life didn't have to be the way it was, and then they told people that the motivation for that change was Jesus. It's one thing for Islamic soldiers to ride into a village, force people to convert at the point of a sword, and kill anybody who doesn't, versus people willingly converting when they see God transforming lives. The timing of Jesus' life and death and the way that Christianity spread and the speed that it spread and the method that it spread are nothing short of miraculous. And like I said, we'll examine this in a lot more detail in a future session. I became a Christian when I was 34. I spent between 20 and 25 years as an atheist. I knew for a fact that we either could or would explain every aspect of our existence scientifically, and that God was an unnecessary human invention meant to fill gaps in our knowledge. I've come to realize that the opposite is true. It's not just irrational, but an act of great self-deception to look at the world and conclude that God does not exist. He has made his presence known in many ways, and I pray that you'll use these arguments to break down barriers and open doors for evangelism and apologetics, but also to eliminate doubts within yourself and to draw people to God through Jesus. Thank you for listening. Here's the resource again, my contact information, and a link to the slideshows and videos. God bless, and look forward to next month's session. We start part 1 of a 2-part session on salvation.